Locke begins where Hobbes began, with the state of nature, that pre-political condition where no government exists. But Locke's state of nature is fundamentally different from Hobbes's war of all against all, and this difference determines everything that follows. For Locke, the state of nature is a state of perfect freedom. Individuals can order their actions and dispose of their possessions as they see fit, within the bounds of natural law. It is also a state of equality where no one has more power or jurisdiction than another. So far, this resembles Hobbes. But then Locke adds something revolutionary. The state of nature is not a state of license. What does this mean? Even in the state of nature, before any government exists, humans are bound by natural law, a moral law accessible to reason, which commands that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. This natural law exists independently of human will or positive law. It's not created by sovereigns, as Hobbes argued, but discovered by reason reflecting on human nature and God's intentions for humanity. This is a direct repudiation of Hobbes. For Hobbes, the state of nature contains no justice or injustice, no right or wrong, because these concepts require law, and law requires a sovereign to create it. Locke argues the opposite. Moral law exists prior to government, grounded in nature and knowable through reason. Government doesn't create morality, it enforces pre-existing moral obligations. Why isn't Locke's state of nature a war of all against all? Because natural law prohibits harming others except in self-defense and punishment of violators. Rational humans can recognize these obligations and generally follow them. The state of nature isn't perfect, it has inconveniences, Locke will identify, but it's not the Hobbesian nightmare of perpetual fear and violence.
Moreover, Locke argues that in the state of nature, everyone has the right to enforce natural law. If someone violates natural law by harming you, you have the right to punish them proportionally. More surprisingly, you have the right to punish violations of natural law even when you are not the victim, because natural law protects everyone, and everyone has an interest in its enforcement. This creates what Locke calls the executive power of the law of nature, the right to enforce natural law that all humans possess in the state of nature. This power will become crucial for understanding political authority, because Locke will argue that governmental power ultimately derives from this natural executive power transferred to political institutions. But if the state of nature isn't terrible, why leave it? Why create government at all? Locke identifies three key inconveniences. First, in the state of nature, there is no established, settled, known law accepted by everyone. Natural law exists, but people interpret it differently, often in self-serving ways. Second, there is no known and indifferent judge with authority to settle disputes according to law. Third, there is no power sufficient to enforce just sentences and give them execution. These inconveniences make the state of nature very unsafe, very insecure, though not Hobbes' state of war. Rational individuals therefore have good reason to establish government, but not absolute government. Because the state of nature isn't intolerable, the price of leaving it doesn't need to be total submission. This sets up Locke's fundamental challenge to Hobbes. We need government for convenience and security, not survival, so we needn't surrender everything to obtain it.
Having established that natural law exists in the state of nature, Locke now identifies what that law protects: natural rights. These rights exist prior to government, independently of any sovereign's will, grounded in human nature and God's intentions for humanity. Locke identifies three fundamental natural rights: life, liberty, and property. These aren't gifts from government or conventions created by society. They're inherent in human beings by virtue of being human. This is revolutionary. If rights exist prior to government, then government can't legitimately violate them. The entire purpose of government becomes protecting these pre-existing rights rather than creating rights through law. The right to life is foundational. God created humans with a purpose, Locke argues, and no one has the right to destroy God's creation arbitrarily. You don't own yourself in the sense of having absolute power over your own life. God owns you. But you do have the right not to be killed or harmed by others. And because you don't own yourself absolutely, you can't sell yourself into slavery or authorize your own destruction, which will become important for limiting political obligation. The right to liberty means freedom from arbitrary power. In the state of nature, you're free to act within the bounds of natural law without requiring anyone's permission. This liberty isn't unlimited. Natural law constrains it, but it's substantial, and crucially, it exists independently of political authority. Government doesn't grant liberty, it can only regulate liberty's exercise for the common good. The right to property is where Locke makes his most original and controversial contribution. How do property rights originate? Hobbes argued that property is conventional, created by the sovereign's law. Before government, nothing is mine or thine, everyone has right to everything. Locke demolishes this argument with his labor theory of property. God gave the earth to mankind in common, Locke agrees. But how does something held in common become private property? Through labor. When you mix your labor with something from nature, when you gather acorns, cultivate land, or hunt gear, you add something of yourself to it. Your labor is yours, so what you mix your labor with becomes yours as well, at least up to certain limits. This is brilliant and radical. Property rights exist prior to government because they arise from self-ownership and labor, not from law. When government is later created, it must respect these pre-existing property rights. The sovereign can't arbitrarily take property because property doesn't flow from sovereign will, but from natural right. Locke sets limits on property acquisition in the state of nature. First, you can only take what you can use before it spoils. You can't waste. Second, you must leave enough and as good for others. These provisos ensure property acquisition doesn't harm others or violate natural law's requirement not to harm others in their possessions. But Locke then introduces money, and everything changes. Money doesn't spoil, so the spoilage limitation disappears. With money, you can accumulate far beyond immediate needs by selling surplus for durable currency. The enough and as good proviso becomes complicated. Property rights through labor remain valid, even when inequality results. Why does Locke spend so much time on property? Because it becomes the pivot for his entire political theory. If property exists before government and independently of it, then government's legitimacy depends on protecting property, not creating it. And if government violates property rights systematically, it reaches its fundamental purpose and loses legitimacy. This provides theoretical ground for resistance and revolution. The triad of life, liberty, and property, which in the American Declaration of Independence becomes life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, represents inviolable boundaries that government must respect. This is Locke's alternative to Hobbesian absolutism. Government exists to protect rights, not to grant them, and its power is therefore inherently limited by those rights.